For 300 years, they had terrified the world. The horses were trained from birth, not to charge, but to ignore screaming. The iron blades extending from the axles were kept sharp enough to split a shield in two. A single chariot team, driven into a line of infantry, could open a gap wide enough to pour cavalry through. Alexander had faced them at Gaugamela. Rome had faced them at Tigranocerta. Every army that encountered them for the first time made the same mistake: they ran. On the morning of August 2nd, 47 BC, Pharnaces II ordered his scythe chariots to advance. Across the valley, the men they were charging were not standing in formation. They were digging. Wool tunics soaked through with sweat. Spades striking limestone. A quartermaster sitting on an overturned crate, dragging a stylus across a wax tablet, tallying bundles of fascines. They were building a supply depot. No one had given the order to stop. The horses crested the ridge. The men set down their spades. They picked up their javelins. He dreamed of rebuilding a Hellenistic paradise, standing as the grand savior of the East against the Roman Leviathan. Gathering his scythed chariots and loyal levies, the king launched a bold, decisive strike against Caesar's exhausted veterans. But the steep incline of Zela stripped away his momentum, turning his terrifying ancient weapons against his own men. There was no heroic clash of swords, only the grim, synchronized advance of bored legionaries thrusting their iron blades. The conqueror barely lifts his head from his paperwork, dispatching 3 arrogant words to the Senate. In a world where absolute power mechanizes violence, is there any room left for the romantic glory of the past? At Zela, history delivered its answer in exactly 4 hours. The ghost in the dust. The sun hammered the Anatolian plains into a cracked expanse of baked clay and fractured limestone. It was the 2nd day of August, in the year 47 BC. The heat rose from the earth in shimmering waves. It distorted the horizon line where the valley dipped and rose again toward the fortified town of Zela. The winds that swept across the rugged highlands of Pontus carried the dust of a dying epic. In the distant reaches of Asia Minor, an anachronistic ghost dared to challenge this modern Leviathan. The shadow of the past hung heavily over the East. Pharnaces II, ruler of the Bosporan kingdom, believed he was a sovereign monarch. Pharnaces II, the ambitious but tragically misguided son of the legendary Mithridates VI, looked upon the Mediterranean and saw an opportunity. For decades, his father had been the great boogeyman of the Roman Senate, a poison-drinking king who had defied the legions time and again. Now, Pharnaces II observed the civil wars of Rome. The conflict between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great had drained the frontier of its legions and its attention. For him, this was the moment to reclaim the lost glory of the Pontic Empire. He would reconstruct a Hellenistic kingdom that had once brought Rome to its knees. Yet, 16 years prior, he was the very architect of the rebellion that drove his own father, Mithridates VI, to suicide in order to surrender to Rome. His father's corpse became nothing more than a splendid bribe offered to Pompey. The price of his treason was the wholesale surrender of the coastlines his father had defended with blood, all to secure a pathetic frontier throne. Now, he was marching to reclaim the very empire he had personally sold off. He moved swiftly. Pharnaces occupied Colchis, Lesser Armenia and Cappadocia. When the Roman governor Gnaeus Domitius Calvinus attempted to halt this expansion at the Battle of Nicopolis, the result was a catastrophe. The Roman forces were shattered, their lines broken, and the Legio 36 was forced into a desperate, humiliating retreat. The East, it seemed, was rising again. But history is rarely dictated by the ghosts of the past. It is shaped by the brutal logistics of the present. The Architecture of Exhaustion. By July of 47 BC, Julius Caesar departed the opulent, blood-soaked streets of Ptolemaic Egypt. He marched north through Syria, his path cutting through Cilicia and Cappadocia. He was not leading a fresh, triumphant army eager for glory. He was leading a war machine that was profoundly tired. The core of his force was the legendary Legio VI Ferrata, the ironclad. These were the veterans of Alesia, of Pharsalus, of Alexandria. They had marched across Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, fought their Roman brethren, and had just endured grueling, claustrophobic urban combat. Their armor was dented, their sandals worn, and their minds calloused to the horrors of death. For these men, the grand geopolitical ambitions of an Eastern king were not a glorious challenge or a terrifying threat. They were a tedious, irritating administrative inconvenience standing between them and their long overdue retirement. Pharnaces attempted diplomatic negotiations, leveraging his past assistance to Pompey, hoping to stall the Roman advance. He relied on the Lex Pompeia, the legal framework his father's conqueror had established in the East, to legitimize his territorial claims. He sent emissaries to the Roman Senate, burying the magistrates in legal scrolls, citing archaic boundary disputes and the traditional autonomy of client kings. To Caesar's advancing camp, he deployed envoys bearing golden crowns and copies of treaties signed by Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus. These documents guaranteed his right to rule the Cimmerian Bosporus. Pharnaces utilized the traditional Roman legal framework of the client state. He insisted he had only reclaimed territories unjustly stripped from his father. He offered to assist Caesar against the remnants of Pompey's faction. He expected negotiations. He expected the slow, deliberate grind of senatorial diplomacy, the exchange of hostages, the drafting of a new foedus. Caesar, operating with cold, bureaucratic efficiency, rejected the terms entirely. In a letter dispatched to the Pontic camp, Caesar refused to recognize the Pompeian treaties. He noted that the Senate had never formally ratified Pompey's eastern settlements with a lex. By exploiting this constitutional loophole, Caesar declared Pharnaces' original kingship null. Furthermore, Caesar weaponized the concept of imperium. He informed the Pontic envoys that a client king's authority emanated solely from the grace of the Roman people. That grace was currently embodied entirely in his own person as dictator. By crossing the borders of Cappadocia, Pharnaces had not declared war on a faction. He had violated the public peace of Rome. He was no longer recognized as a king. He was designated a rebel magistrate. This classification removed any protection under the laws of war. There would be no ransom. There would be no treaty. I shall not pardon the injuries done to the Republic, because of benefits offered to me." The reply was delivered orally to the envoys. Caesar demanded the immediate withdrawal from Pontus, the restitution of all plundered wealth, and the release of all Roman citizens. Pharnaces attempted the ultimate bureaucratic defense, the delay. He agreed to the terms in principle. He began to march his army slowly, citing logistical difficulties. He requested clarification on the borders of withdrawal. He sent a second embassy to debate the exact valuation of the plundered goods. He sought to stretch the calendar until Caesar's mutinous legions, in Italy or his enemies in Africa, forced the dictator to abandon the East. Caesar did not write back. He marched. The march continued. They moved at 20 miles a day through the punishing Anatolian summer. The rapid advance collapsed the time and space Pharnaces had relied upon. The Pontic king found himself cornered at Zela, the exact geographic location where his father had annihilated a Roman army 20 years prior. The morning of August 2nd begins not with the sound of trumpets, but with the scrape of iron against stone. It is 6 o'clock in the morning. The Roman forces arrive at the high ridge opposite the Pontic position. Beneath the modern agricultural fields of Zile, in the Turkish province of Tokat, lies this steep, unassuming hill known as Altınyalar. Modern topographical surveys and institutions, mapping the ancient topography of Asia Minor, have confirmed the severe incline of this ridge. If you walk the gradient of this slope today, the physical exertion required to reach the summit is immediate and relentless. The lungs burn. The footing slips. There is a sheer, undeniable gravity to this terrain. The Roman legionaries dropped their packs. They unhooked their dolabras. They began to dig. They intended to fortify their camp, establish a supply line, and starve the Pontic army into submission. On this high ground, the men of the 6th Legion drove iron spades into the dirt. The impact of metal against stone rang out in a disjointed, rhythmic clatter. They wore no armor. Wool tunics clung to their shoulder blades, soaked through with sweat. Dust caked their forearms. They dug the trenches with the methodical, unhurried pace of laborers who had spent their entire adult lives moving earth from one place to another. Their skin bore the white lines of old campaigns. They did not speak. They conserved their breath. Beside the growing mound of excavated dirt, a quartermaster sat on an overturned crate. He dragged a stylus across a wax tablet, tallying bundles of fascines. The primary accounts recorded in De Bello Alexandrino capture a moment of genuine Roman disbelief on this day. Caesar's troops were not arrayed in shining lines of battle. Entrenchment was the foundation of Roman military supremacy. The Roman military genius relied as much on the spade as it did on the sword. For 4 hours, from dawn until mid-morning, the ridge of Altınyalar was a vast, sweating construction site. The Illogical Ascent. Across the intervening valley, less than 5 miles away, the army of Pharnaces II blanketed the opposite slope. The kingdom of Pontus presented itself as a glittering mirage. Sunlight caught the silver scales of their cuirasses. Bronze shield bosses flared like struck sparks. Silk banners caught the dry updrafts, snapping in the wind. The Eastern king had arranged his forces according to the old Hellenistic manuals. Phalanxes stood in rigid blocks. Cavalry flanked the infantry. In the vanguard, a line of side chariots, the quadrigae falcatae, sat motionless. These anachronistic vehicles, equipped with long, spinning curved iron blades extending from their axles, honed to razor edges, were a weapon of antiquity. Their wooden wheels were painted black. They were a terrifying remnant of Persian and Mithridatic warfare, designed to strike psychological terror into undisciplined levies. Behind them surged the tumultuarious, hastily raised local levies lacking the deep cohesion of professional infantry. Pharnaces projected absolute, unbending royal authority. Pharnaces stood by his royal pavilion. He watched the Roman line dismantle its armor and begin earthworks. He saw an enemy vulnerable, divided, and dismissive. He sought to crush the Romans before their trenches were dug. He ordered the trumpets to sound the advance. According to the historical chronicles of Appian, Pharnaces initiated a maneuver that defied every principle of ancient military doctrine. Pharnaces ordered his forces to cross the valley floor and charge directly up the steep, punishing incline of the Altinjaller Hill. It was a maneuver that can only be described as tactical suicide. They poured into the depression and began the ascent. The terrain was steep. The gradient defied tactical logic. Loose scree slid beneath the hooves of the Pontic horses. The side chariots led the charge, draft animals straining against the harnesses. Leather snapped. Whips cracked over the backs of the horses. The massive wooden wheels bit into the incline, kicking up clouds of pulverized rock. The charioteers leaned forward, fighting gravity, driving their teams up the severe slope directly toward the unfinished Roman camp. Julius Caesar sat on a folding stool near the command tent. A courier pointed toward the valley. Caesar did not stand. He rested his chin on his knuckles. He watched the heavily armed infantry and side chariots attempt to maintain momentum while slogging up a precipitous hill. He raised a hand. He motioned to a tribune. The mechanics of slaughter. The brass trumpets sounded. A single, flat note cut through the sound of the approaching hooves. The men in the trenches stopped digging. They dropped their spades. They walked to the rear of the earthworks. They picked up their iron-rimmed shields. They lifted their heavy javelins. The transition from laborers to soldiers took less than 30 seconds. There was no shouting. There was no sudden panic. Men fastened the leather straps of their helmets under their chins. They locked their shields together. The iron rings of their lorica hamata settled over their shoulders with a dull, heavy scrape. They formed up behind the dirt mounds. The dust settled on their crests. The ground shook violently now. The rumble of the chariot wheels grew deafening. The horses frothed at the mouth, their eyes rolling back white in their sockets, driven mad by the whips and the unnatural incline. The front line of the 6th Legion stood perfectly still. The centurions paced behind them, measuring the distance with cold eyes. 50 paces, 40 paces. The command dropped. Thousands of arms drew back. Thousands of iron-tipped pila left Roman hands. The sky darkened. The wood hissed through the dry air. The systematic, merciless rain descended upon the ascent. Iron pierced oak. Armor-piercing shanks pinned shields together, drove through the necks of the horses and shattered chariot wheels. The animals collapsed in mid-stride. The forward momentum of the heavy chariots drove them over the falling beasts. Wooden axles snapped with the sound of breaking bone. The scythe wheels spun wildly out of control, catching the earth, flipping the cabs. Charioteers were thrown into the dirt. The iron blades slashed into the horses of the adjacent teams. Farnes's prized terror weapons became death traps. The vanguard disintegrated into a tangle of screaming animals, shattered timber, and bleeding men. The wreckage formed a jagged barricade on the steep slope. The Pontic infantry, following too closely behind, slammed into the wreckage of their own chariots. The charge choked before it even reached the Roman lines. The trumpets sounded a second time. The Roman line stepped over the dirt mounds. They drew their short swords. The gladius cleared the scabbard with a metallic rasp. They began the descent. The men of the Legio Sixferata, on the right flank, did not roar with bloodlust. They locked their large, curved scuta together and initiated a cold, synchronized forward push. They moved in absolute synchronization. Left foot, shield forward. Right foot, the gap closed. They hit the disorganized mass of Pontic infantry. The collision sounds like timber collapsing under the weight of a stone roof. Shield meets shield. The Roman wall absorbs the impact. There is no room for sweeping Hellenistic maneuvers, no space for the elegant flourishes of Eastern cavalry. The legionaries do not swing their swords. They punch forward with the heavy shield boss. They step into the opening. The iron blade slides upward into the abdomen. The wrist twists. The blade pulls free. The man falls. The line steps forward. They do not scream. They breathe through their noses. The exertion is purely physical, entirely mechanical. A Pontic spearman drives his weapon at a Roman face. The legionary deflects the ash shaft with the edge of his scutum. He steps inside the guard and drives the point of his sword through the Mont's throat. Blood coats the iron. The legionary kicks the collapsing body off his blade and resets his stance. The sun beats down. Sweat burns their eyes. The butchery finds a rhythm: thrust, twist, step. The eastern remnants try to fight back, but their long spears are useless in the crush. Their silver armor dents under the crushing blows. The steep incline that Farnes's foolishly forced his men to climb now becomes their inescapable graveyard. Pressed backward by the relentless pressure, men slip on the blood-slicked grass and rocks. They fall over the corpses of their comrades, tumbling backward into the valley, in a chaotic avalanche of shattered armor and broken ambition. The 6th Legion grinds over them like a millstone crushing grain. Severed limbs pile against the broken chariot wheels. The smell of opened bowels mixes with the dry dust and horse blood. A Roman soldier takes a glancing blow to his helmet, shakes his head, spits out a chipped tooth, and drives his sword into the knee of his attacker. As the man goes down, the Roman steps on his chest, driving his nailed boot into the sternum, and pulls his weapon free. The massacre is devoid of passion. It is an industrial slaughter, executed with the mundane efficiency of a butcher processing meat. The veterans want to finish the shift. They cut down the enemy with the same detached efficiency they used to dig the ditch. The Pontic lines shatter. Soldiers break rank, throwing away shields, stripping off ornate armor, trampling each other in desperation. The Romans maintain the line. They march down the hill, over the dying, driving their swords into anything that twitches. They cross the valley floor. They begin the ascent up the opposite hill, toward the Pontic fortifications. The garrison left to guard the camp attempts a defense. The Romans dismantle them. The palisades are breached. Tents are pulled down. The slaughter continues inside the camp parameters, until no one is left standing. Pharnaces too mounts a fast horse, and rides out the rear gate with a handful of cavalry. He abandons his army, his kingdom, and the corpse of his father's dream. A mere 5 months ago, Mithridates of Pergamon, the illegitimate son of Mithridates VI, saved Caesar from the mud of the Nile. And now, Pharnaces II, the legitimate son of Mithridates VI, is fleeing through the dust of Zela, broken by Caesar. Pharnaces rode to Sinop, on the coast, held it briefly against Domitius Calvinus' pursuit, then sailed for the Bosporus. He assembled Scythian and Sarmatian auxiliaries in the Crimea. He captured Theodosia and Panticapaeum, the cities he had ruled before. Then he met Asander. Asander had been Pharnaces' own governor in the Bosporus, the man left in charge while Pharnaces went south to reclaim the world. In the years of Pharnaces' absence, Asander had built his own power base. He had his own loyalty from the local nobility. When Pharnaces returned from his defeat with his Scythian troops and his remaining ambitions, Asander gave battle and won it. The sources disagree on the exact manner of Pharnaces' death. Appian says he died fighting. Cassius Dio says he was captured and then killed, but they agree on the outcome. He was roughly 50 years old. The fighting stops. The entire engagement, the destruction of an empire's final hope, has taken merely 4 hours, from the first javelin throw to the fall of the camp. The hollow echo of a machine. The silence returns to the valley, broken only by the sound of flies swarming the open wounds. Today, beneath the soil of Altenjaller, the earth is remarkably silent. There are no dense layers of shattered bone, no oxidized fields of iron weaponry, no mass graves. The landscape has swallowed the trauma. But on that August afternoon, tens of thousands of bodies carpeted the depression between the hills. Back at the Roman fortifications, Julius Caesar enters his tent. He removes his cloak. The air inside the canvas is stifling. He sits at his campaign desk. A scribe stands in the corner, holding a fresh sheet of parchment and an inkhorn. The campaign to pacify the East had taken a mere 5 days. Caesar looks at a map of the eastern provinces, rubs his exhausted eyes, and thinks of the civil war still waiting for him in Africa. He ordered the quartermasters to inventory the captured Pontic baggage train. He dictated letters regarding the grain supply in Antioch and the taxation rates in Bithynia. He then signed the decree appointing the new ruler of the Bosporus. The throne was awarded to Mithridates of Pergamon. The fatal, feudal crusade of the legitimate son was reduced to a single line item on a ledger, a payout to the illegitimate son who had served Rome at the Nile. He needs to return to Rome. This entire campaign was an annoying detour forced upon him by a minor king with delusions of relevance. The official military chronicle, De Bello Alexandrino, paints a picture of flawless Roman execution, claiming entirely negligible Roman losses. Yet, modern military historians, examining the physical realities of the terrain and the mechanics of ancient warfare, suggest a darker narrative. The steepness of the Altignaler slope confirms that the Pontic charge was tactically irrational. But the sheer momentum of thousands of men crashing into a partially unfortified Roman camp of digging soldiers would have generated a massive kinetic shock. Some scholars argue that the Roman losses in those initial, chaotic minutes were likely far higher than the official propaganda admits. The veterans of Legio VI bled into the dirt of Zyle, their lives expended not in a glorious tactical masterstroke, but in a brutal, desperate scramble to hold the line against an unpredictable enemy. To Amantius, in Rome, Caesar says, though modern scholarship points toward the political operative Gaius Matius, the biographer Plutarch records the recipient as Amantius. The scribe dips his reed pen. Veni, Caesar says. The pen scratches across the surface. Vidi. The scribe waits. Vici. Caesar stands up. He walks to the basin and washes the dust from his hands. Outside, the quartermaster resumes his tally, counting the salvaged spears, stacking them neatly by the ditch. This dispatch of 3 words, a Latin tricolon designed for maximum rhetorical impact, is the most enduring artifact of the campaign. Suetonius, writing in the early 2nd century, recorded the scene from Caesar's subsequent triumph in Rome. These 3 Latin words were emblazoned on a placard carried before his chariot, presented to the roaring crowds. But it was not a celebration of a hard-won victory against a worthy foe. It was a calculated political weapon. The phrase equated the mere act of observing the enemy with the act of annihilating them. It completely erased the sweat, the frantic digging, and the blood spilled on the slope. Historians interpret this dispatch not as an arrogant boast, but as a meticulously crafted piece of propaganda directed at the Roman Senate. Caesar needed to diminish the perceived difficulty of the Eastern Front. The 3 Mithridatic Wars stretched from 89 BC to 63 BC. Nearly 3 decades of Roman blood and treasure poured into the same territory. He needed to show that while his rival, Pompey, had spent years struggling against the Mithridatic threat, Caesar could eradicate its final remnants in a matter of days. He needed to prove to a nervous capital that his time in Egypt had not softened him. The phrase Veni, Vidi, Vici, dripping with aristocratic disdain, was a declaration of profound boredom. It emphasized how staggeringly little effort was required to extinguish a king. It was a message to the Roman Senate that while they squabbled and feared the ghosts of Mithridates, Caesar had swatted his heir away like a fly. Yet, the ornate rhetoric of these 3 words inflicted 0 physical damage upon his true enemies. While Caesar hoisted his arrogant placard before the Roman mob, the remnants of Pompey's faction ignored the billboard entirely. In the silence of Thapsus, in North Africa and Munda, in Hispania, they were assembling massive legions. The fierce Republican resistance could not be cut by a dictator's concise catchphrase. Late in August, Caesar departs for Rome via Galatia. The Battle of Zela occupies a strange, liminal space in the history of the world. It was not a battle that saved the Republic, nor was it a tactical masterpiece studied in the academies of later centuries. It was, at its core, a mopping up operation. But its significance lies precisely in its clinical, detached nature. Zella marked the final, quiet liquidation of the Mithridatic legacy. The Hellenistic dream of an Eastern empire capable of resisting the West died on that hillside. It was crushed not by inspired heroism, but by the terrifying efficiency of a professionalized military bureaucracy. The Eastern kings, clinging to the romantic illusions of scythed chariots and ancestral glory, were swept away by men who were more concerned with finishing their defensive trenches than with the poetry of combat. The victory at Zella was the hollow echo of a machine. It cemented the architecture of Roman hegemony, showcasing a grim new reality. Rome was a state so overwhelmingly powerful, so utterly mechanized in its application of violence, and so profoundly weary. It could conquer the world not with fire and passion, but through sheer, detached, mechanical exhaustion. The legions packed their gear, their faces devoid of triumph, their eyes fixed on the long road back to a city that was preparing to burn. The quartermasters finished the inventory 3 days after the battle. They catalogued the Pontic baggage train with the same methodical care they used for everything else. Grain stores, iron weapons, bolt fabric. The side chariot components, axles, iron blades, harness fittings, were listed by weight and condition, their value estimated in denarii. 12 lines on a wax tablet. 300 years of terror. 12 lines.